The book is about the nearly 4,000 men who served in the Australian Army during World War II in a particular part of the army, which was called the employment companies. They were in a series of companies scattered across the land. And what made them distinctive, it wasn't their uniform, it wasn't the rules, everything else, they were proper soldiers, from the boots to their hats, to all the regulations, the pay, they were soldiers. But they were themselves aliens. Now, the term alien is a legal term in Australia, which means somebody who is not, well, in those days particularly, was not regarded as a British citizen. Australians were all British citizens at that time. And these were men who came largely, but not entirely, not only from Europe, but various parts of Europe. Some had been here generations, Italians, Greeks, Jews, all sorts of nationalities. Others were very recently arrived. There were a whole company of Chinese, local Chinese, and there were a whole range of nationalities who, because of the exigencies of the war, became soldiers. And they were soldiers in the full extent that they were never sent overseas. And also, they were never taught to fire a gun. And there were some rather delightful tales I was told by a number of the men that I interviewed. I did a lot of interviewing for this book, that there was high expectation, particularly in one company. The story was that a truck drove into the camp with on the back of the truck were rifles piled high. The men were very excited. At last, they thought they're going to be taught how to shoot. Within about 15 minutes, the truck had been turned around and out it went. It had gone to the wrong place. The men were never taught to shoot. Ironically, however, they were, particularly as the war came to its end, a number of them spent years, their last years in the army, unloading armaments. And during the war itself, they were loading and unloading trains, which included all sorts of weaponry. And towards the end of the war, they were actually taking out the power fire, as it were, powder from the guns, but they were never actually ever taught to fire. The difficulty of answering that is that it depends now. I mean, I don't have the knowledge that I have about that period to be able to cover the whole of Australia currently and to be able to tell. In some ways, the attitudes to foreigners today are much better than they were in the 1930s and 1940s. There was still very much the sense during the period when the war was, 1939, 1945, that Australia was part of the British Empire, that it was really a British country. And all these people who were not British were somehow not entirely the 100% what the country wanted and needed. Mind you, it had an enormous number of these people going back really from the very beginnings of settlement, of European settlement of Australia. This is a very different situation in Australia today, where immigration has been probably the foremost builder of the society for a very long time. Yes, yes. In the book, I quote a letter received by the then Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, from a woman, I think from Western Australia, expressing her disappointment and indeed her disgust at the thought of bringing in non-British aliens into this country. there was undoubtedly among a section of the population such a view. But there's no way that I think they didn't have polls in those days. Nobody was counting. So we don't actually have any, what you might call, or without inverted commas, scientific evidence of attitudes. But we do know, for example, for letters to the editor in newspapers. I had an interesting time reading letters to the editor in a variety of newspapers, and often it depended on the newspaper, because there were some papers that were very hostile to aliens, and they happily published letters in quantity of that kind. But the major dailies were not like that, and you get a mixture. So you'll get the letter of a woman who writes that her husband is fighting at the front, and why, how can we have these foreigners in the same uniform as her husband? That kind of attitude. At the same time, and I remember one letter along those lines, and I think I cite it in the book. In the next issue of the paper is a response from one of the men who's in one of the alien employment companies, pointing out that they are Hitler's most passionate enemies in the world, because they know of the danger and the horror he causes, and that he and his fellow alien soldiers are absolutely devoted to the cause of defeating Hitler. And that is published in the same paper, in the same letters column, a day or two later. And that's interesting as well. And I have a whole chapter, I think I have two chapters, one about those who attack the aliens and one of those who support them. And it's really quite interesting that the support was quite broad ranged. It ranged from, professors at the universities. It ranged from leaders of some of the churches, not all by any means, but some, and people who had a voice would often, speak up. So it depended a lot on, if it was a newspaper, it depended on the editorial policy of the newspaper, but the major dailies generally chose a variety of letters. That is, some attacking, some defending. Well, sadly, my parents have died, and so I can't answer that. But members of the family that have responded, well, I think, I'm not even sure, to be perfectly honest, I'm not even sure if they've read the book yet, but they're very proud that it's appeared. That's how families are. I wish that my father and my mother could have read the book. I'd be very interested in their different perspectives, because you have one of the things that I think about the book now, and I think there's another book that needs to be written. I'm not writing it, but somebody ought, about those who are left behind at home. My mother has to go on. My parents had, not, I think, long before my father joins the army, had rented a little shop in Swan Street, Richmond, where they sold ladies' stockings and blouses and such items. And we lived in Carlton. I think it was 2 or perhaps 3 different tram rides to go from our house. Of course, we never owned a car. And so after my father joins the army, my mother has alone to go every morning from North Carlton to Richmond on the 3 trams, to open the shop, to spend the day there, then to come home and cook dinner for her daughter. I mean, there's a whole book to be written about those who aren't in the army, but who are serving in their own way. One of the things that stands out I don't think I can say that there's a greatest thing or anything like that. But I can say that one of the things that interested me was the humour. Um, Even in difficult circumstances, sometimes perhaps particularly in difficult circumstances, humour played an important role. It broke the ice. It brought big things down to smaller size. I mean, I can't think of many examples, but I remember on one occasion, the men are, I forget which company it is now, but the men are all lined up, and the sergeant who was trying to get them to learn to march and salute and to do all these things, which don't come naturally, shall we say, and he decides to play the game of Simon Says. Now, I don't know how many of our listeners and watchers know that game, but most children learn it at school. But somebody stands out in front and gives sharp directions, hands on heads, clap your hands and so on. But really the only time you're supposed to do it is if it is prefaced by Simon Says, and it's a sort of trick. If you do it when Simon Says, if you don't listen carefully and you clap your hands and it wasn't Simon Says, well, you're out of the game, you know. And there's a lovely moment which I actually cite in the book, where a sergeant, I think, trying to get a bit of liveliness into the thing, tries to play Simon Says with the men. Simon says, salute, Simon says, and one of the men turns to the other and says, who is this Simon? I included that in the book. I thought it was lovely.